Hello again on this Saturday Sabbath, the day before the Lord's Day. Virtues for a crisis. And today I want to look at the virtues of Jesus Christ, the virtues of the man, Jesus. Because, as I said before, we learn virtue not so much from being taught principles and propositions. We learn virtue by looking at it. And we can look at virtue in the Bible through the various many proverbs of the Bible, but also through the stories. And of all the stories, this one is the one that reveals most the virtue of Christ, the best man, and therefore the virtues which would be good to see in Christian churches. Jesus' crisis, which of course began at Gethsemane, went through the three different trials, the beatings, the crowning with the thorns, and then the pinning to the cross, and the crisis which ended when he made his final shout at sunset on that Good Friday. And to learn from Christ, we're going to turn to the writings of the Apostle Peter. Because I believe Peter was the apostle who had the greatest appreciation of Jesus as a man. He loved Jesus as a man. Now John was the disciple that Jesus loved best. We know that. And I think I can theorize as to why. John was the only apostle who really understood what Jesus was saying half the time. He was the one who got it. He was the one who was called John the Divine by the medieval theologians, because it means John the Theologian. John was sharpest on the uptake when Jesus was trying to say things. And that, I believe, is why we have those unique monologues in John's Gospel. He was the only one who was keeping up with Jesus half the time in those conversations. So if you want the clearest theology about the incarnation, where do you go? You go to the Gospels, the letters, and the Revelation of John. If you want to look into the Trinity as far as a human being can, again you go to John's writings. But there's more to Christianity than theology. And when Peter and John run to the empty tomb on Easter Sunday, that early morning, because John is the theologian, he believes. He sees the signs of resurrection and he understands. Whereas Peter takes time to catch up. Literally, because he's the older man and can't run as fast as John, but he takes time to catch up mentally because he didn't have the theological acuity of John. But he loved Jesus best. I think that's what I'm trying to say. He loved Jesus, the man, best of all. And he loved him in a human way. He loved him as a brother. He loved him as a fellow man, as a comrade. Jesus knew that Peter's love for him was deeply loyal. It may sometimes have looked more like the loyalty of a dumb dog, whereas John's loyalty was the loyalty of an informed theologian. But in the end, the love of Peter for Jesus was unarguable. And I think that's why Peter was named as the rock. I think that's why Jesus made him the most foundational of the 12 foundation stones. And I think that's also why that Peter is the model for pastoral ministry. Pastoral ministry involves the work of teaching. So we need something of John the Apostle in our pastors. But the thing we need most of all is the heart of Peter, the lover of Jesus, the lover of Christ, the best brother to Jesus. So when I'm teaching pastors, I always ask them, who is the model pastor in the New Testament? And of course they usually give me the wrong answer. They tell me it's Jesus. When I say that's wrong, they have a go at others like Paul. But really it's Peter. I think Peter has the pastor's heart. Incidentally, this is why one reason why I cannot believe the Catholic doctrine of the Pope being St. Peter on earth today. Because a man who lacks that heart, that great heart of Peter, is in no way the successor of Peter. Now, in the 2 letters of Peter, you'll find that Christian character and Christian virtue hold centre stage. He's interested in seeing what you might call the character of Christ in the church. And so when we turn to the letters of Peter, we find that the religion that Peter teaches is a completely human religion. It is full of the virtues of Christian faith. And it's based on Jesus, the man himself. And he challenges us to build our lives on the foundation of Jesus, the man. Anyway, that's a lot of chit-chat from me. Before we go any further, I think it's time to read from 1 Peter. And I'm going to read 1 Peter chapter 2 from verse 13 onwards. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honour the emperor. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering, because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you are healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. A very rich reading, and I want to draw out of it the crucial idea that Jesus is our model. Jesus is our guide for how to behave in a crisis. The virtues that Jesus revealed in his behaviour and speech during his trial, beatings and crucifixion are precisely the virtues that he's urging on us. This is why he can even tell the slave with a harsh master, submit for God's sake. Now, I've been talking about 3 particular virtues the last few days: quietness, hesukia, patient endurance, prudence. And if you go back to the old gospel stories in the gospels, you can see the quietness, the patient endurance, and indeed the good judgment, the prudence of Jesus during those last 18 or 20 terrible hours. And it's important to remember that the Passion of Christ is not just the time pinned to the cross. It is also the time before that crucifixion. In this, the Catholics are quite good. They talk about the Passion of Christ, and they're very definite that the Passion of Christ begins in Gethsemane, and I'm sure they're right on this. It's important to remember that Jesus was abandoned by the Father to suffer alone. That is part of the crisis. So he didn't have what he normally enjoyed, which was that constant interchange with the Father. That thing that he said was only doing what the Father told him. In those last few hours, Jesus really was on his own. He was the man suffering for mankind. He laid aside his omniscience when he was born, but now he laid aside the familiarity with God that he'd enjoyed during his public ministry. He was in many ways left on his own. And I think sometimes when we're really tested, that's how we feel. We feel that God has left us pretty much on our own. And that's when Christian virtue really becomes apparent. Not when we're enjoying rich and continuous fellowship in the Spirit, but when we're on our own, left with our love and loyalty for Jesus to work out with fear and trembling. And as you look at Jesus, you see his quietness, you see his patience, you see his prudence. He chose what to say and when to say it, and what to do and when to do it. And in verse 22, I think that verse is not about the general sinlessness of Jesus as a sort of statement of theology. When it says, he committed no sin and no deceit was found in his mouth, I think what Peter has in mind particularly is this day, when Jesus was under maximum stress. He committed no sin and no deceit was found in his mouth. He lived out the virtues that he commended. So that's my thought for the day. Tomorrow is the Lord's Day, and I think I'm going to continue looking at the virtues of Jesus. But I think that's enough for now. Just to say that Jesus never asks us to do anything that he hasn't done himself. If he challenges us to live by the Christian virtues, we know he did it. Well, have a good day. May God bless you as you wait on him.